Hi, welcome to Lies and Secrets channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. I've always been the type to wear my heart on my sleeve. It's both a blessing and a curse. I suppose my name's Annalise and I've lived in this small town of Millbrook my entire life. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone and secrets are about as rare as snow. In June, I work at the local library, surrounded by books and the whispered conversations of our regulars. It's not much, but it's honest work and I love it. My husband Jacob, his cut from a different cloth. Don't get me wrong. I love the man. But sometimes I wonder if we're reading from the same book. He works at the bank in town. All numbers and practicality. Every penny we earn is accounted for, tucked away for a rainy day that always seems to be looming on his horizon. It's admirable, really, how he can turn saving money into an Olympic sport. But sometimes I can't help but feel like we're preparing for a storm that might never come, all while missing out on the sunshine right in front of us. Our house isn't much to look at, a modest 3-bedroom with a porch that's seen better days. But it's ours and we've made it a home. Photos of our families line the walls and the quilt. My grandmother made drapes over our well-worn couch. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable. It's us. I remember the day. Everything changed like it was yesterday. It was a Tuesday, nothing special about it. I was running errands after work, picking up groceries and dropping off some overdue library books for Mrs. Edward. She always forgets to, bless her heart. That's when I saw him, Mr. Joshua, standing outside the pharmacy looking about as lost as a sheep without its flock. Now Mr. Joshua, he's been a fixture in Millbrook for as long as anyone can remember. He used to run the hardware store on Main Street before his son took over. I remember him giving me lollipops when I was a kid, always with a wink and a "don't tell your mom." He was the kind of man who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. But that day he looked different. Smaller, somehow like life had pressed down on him until he was a shadow of the man I remembered. His clothes hung loose on his frame and his eyes, those kind eyes that always had a twinkle. They were dull, filled with a sadness I'd never seen before. "Mr. Joshua," I called out, approaching him, "are you all right?" He turned to me and for a moment I saw a flicker of recognition. Then his face crumpled and before I knew it, I was holding this man who had always seemed larger than life, as he sobbed into my shoulder. Between his tears the story came out. Cancer, the big C. It had come for him swiftly and mercilessly. Treatments were expensive, more than his insurance would cover. His son was struggling to keep the hardware store afloat, and Mr. Joshua couldn't bear to ask him for help. He was at the pharmacy to pick up pain medication, all he could afford. Now my heart broke for him. Mr. Joshua, who had been nothing but kindness personified my entire life, was facing his darkest hour alone. And in that moment I made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Joshua," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "let me help you." He tried to refuse, of course. Proud as ever, even in his weakened state. But I was insistent. I told him about our savings, how we had been squirreling away money for years. It wasn't a fortune by any means, but it was enough. Enough to give him a fighting chance. I won't lie, as I stood there in the bank, signing over nearly every cent we had saved. My hands were shaking. I could almost hear Jacob's voice in my head, telling me this was madness. But then I thought of Mr. Joshua of all the times. He had helped others without a second thought, and I knew I was doing the right thing. The relief on Mr. Joshua's face when I told him was indescribable. He hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack, thanking me over and over. I helped him set up his first appointment at the hospital, made sure he had a ride, and then I had to go home and face the music. The drive home was the longest of my life. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to tell Jacob what I'd done. I knew he wouldn't understand. Not at first. Maybe not ever, but I had to try. Our house came into view and my stomach tied itself in knots. The porch light was on. Jacob was home. I sat in the car for a few minutes, gathering my courage. Then, taking a deep breath, I walked inside. Jacob was in the kitchen, heating up leftovers. He looked up when I came in, a smile on his face that quickly faded when he saw my expression. "Annalise, what's wrong?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come instead. To my horror, I burst into tears. Jacob was at my side in an instant, arms around me, asking what had happened. Between sobs, I told him everything about Mr. Joshua, the cancer, and what I'd done with our savings. First, Jacob just stood there, frozen. Then he stepped back, his face a mask of disbelief. "You did what he asked," his voice low and dangerous. I tried to explain to make him understand why I had to help. But with each word I could see Jacob's expression hardening, his eyes growing colder. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he shouted, his voice echoing in our small kitchen. "That was our safety net and Ann's our future, and you just gave it away like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," I shot back, finding my voice at last. "It was everything to Mr. Joshua. He needed help. Jacob, his dying, and what about us?" Jacob's face was red with anger. "Now what happens if one of us loses our job, if the roof starts leaking? The car breaks down? Did you think about any of that?" I had not really in that moment with Mr. Joshua. All I had thought about was helping someone in need. But now, faced with Jacob's fury, doubt began to creep in. "I thought we'd figure it out," I said weakly. "We always do." Jacob laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made me flinch. "Figure it out? You can't just figure out money. Annise, it doesn't work that way." He was pacing now, running his hands through his hair in frustration. I stood there, feeling smaller by the second, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Then, without warning, Jacob whirler around his hand connected with my stomach. Before I could even register what was happening, the force of it knocked the wind out of me and I stumbled backwards. Shocked more than hurt. "What do you think you're doing? You stupid woman." Jacob bellowed, his face a mask of rage I had never seen before. "You've ruined us." I sank to my knees, arms wrapped around myself, protecting my body from any further blows. But it was my heart that hurt the most. That moment, I didn't recognize the man standing before me. This wasn't the Derek I had married, the man who had promised to love and cherish me. This was a stranger consumed by anger and fear. As I knelt there on our kitchen floor, tears streaming down my face, a strange calm came over me. Yes, I had given away our savings. Yes, it would make things difficult for us. But even now, thinking of Mr. Joshua and the hope I had given him, I couldn't bring myself to regret my decision. I looked up at Jacob, who was staring at his hand in horror, as if just realizing what he had done. "I'm sorry, you can't understand why I did it," I said quietly, "but I'm not sorry I did it." Jacob's face crumpled, a mix of anger, shame, and confusion, warring for dominance. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, leaving me alone with the echoes of our shattered peace. As I heard his car roar to life and peel out of the driveway, I slowly got to my feet. My stomach ached where he had struck me, but the pain was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. I made my way to our bedroom, sinking onto the bed we had shared for years. Looking around at the life we had built together, I wondered if this was the end of it all. Had my act of kindness cost me my marriage? As the night wore on and Jacob didn't return, I lay there in the dark questioning everything. But even as doubt and fear gnawed at me, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that I had done the right thing, that sometimes being kind meant making hard choices. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I watched the shadows move across our ceiling, wondering what the morning would bring and if Jacob and I would ever find our way back to each other after this. The night stretched on endlessly, each tick of the clock on our bedside table, a reminder of Jacob's absence. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the evening over and over, the look on Jacob's face, the sting of his hand against my stomach, the slam of the front door as he left it, all swirled in my head like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. As the first rays of sunlight began to creep through our bedroom window, I realized I hadn't slept a wink. My eyes felt gritty, and my body ached from the tension I'd been holding all night. Slowly, I sat up, wincing at the dull pain in my abdomen where Jacob had struck me. It wasn't so much the physical pain that bothered me, but the emotional wound that came with it. In all our years together, through all our arguments and disagreements, he had never raised a hand to me. The fact that he had done so now shook me to my core. I dragged myself out of bed and into the bathroom, avoiding my reflection in the mirror. I didn't want to see the dark circles under my eyes or the remnants of yesterday's mascara streak down my cheeks. Instead, I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the night's events along with my tears. As I made my way to the kitchen, the silence of the house pressed in on me. It was a Saturday, and normally by this time Jacob would be up making coffee, the smell filling our small home. But today there was nothing. Just emptiness and the lingering echo of last night's argument. I went through the motions of making coffee, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind wandered. Had I really done the right thing? The doubt that had started to creep in last night now bloomed fully in the harsh light of day. I thought about Mr. Joshua, imagining him at the hospital, finally getting the treatment he so desperately needed. Then I thought about our empty savings account, and a wave of panic washed over me. What if Jacob was right? What if something happened and we needed that money? What if I had just thrown away our future on a whim? But even as these thoughts raced through my mind, I couldn't bring myself to fully regret my decision. The memory of Mr. Joshua's relief, the hope in his eyes when I told him I could help, it had to be worth something, didn't it? I took my coffee to the front porch, settling into the old rocking chair that had been a wedding gift from my parents. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of Mrs. Henderson's roses from next door. As I sat there, watching the neighborhood come to life, I tried to imagine what would happen when Jacob came home. Would he still be angry? Would he want to talk things through, or worse? Would he not come home at all? The hours ticked by and still no sign of Derek. I busied myself with chores around the house, anything to keep my hands and mind occupied. I scrubbed the kitchen floor until it shone, reorganized the bookshelf in the living room, even tackled the mess in the garage that we'd been ignoring for months. But no matter how much I cleaned or organized, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It was late afternoon when I heard the sound of a car pulling into our driveway. My heart leapt into my throat as I recognized the familiar rumble of Jacob Old Ford. For a moment I stood frozen in the hallway, unsure whether to go to the door or wait for him to come in. Before I could decide, the front door opened and there he was. Jacob looked awful. His clothes were rumpled, his hair a mess, and the dark stubble on his chin told me he hadn't shaved, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. Bloodshot and heavy, with something that looked like a mix of exhaustion and shame, we stood there for what felt like an eternity, just looking at each other. The air between us was thick, with unspoken words and lingering anger. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. Annalise, he said, his voice. Horses. I don't know what to say. I didn't know what to say. Either part of me wanted to run to him, to throw my arms around him and pretend like nothing had happened. But another part, a part that had grown stronger overnight, held me back. This wasn't something we could just sweep under the rug and forget about. Where were you? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before. When he was stressed or upset. I drove, he said. Just drove, ended up at that lookout point up on Miller's Ridge. Spent the night in the car. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Miller's Ridge was where we used to go when we were dating to watch the sunset over the valley. The fact that he had gone there of all places stirred something in me. Jacob took a step towards me, then stopped as if unsure of his welcome. Anais, what I did hitting you. I can't even begin to tell you how sorry I am. It was unforgivable. You're right, I said, my voice steadier now. It was unforgivable. He flinched at my words, but I couldn't bring myself to soften the blow. The memory of his hand striking me was still too fresh, thermal, too raw. I don't know if I can forgive you for that. Continued, at least not right now. But Jacob, I need you to understand why I did what I did with the money. Mr. Joshua. I know, Jacob interrupted, surprising me. I know why you did it, and that's part of why I'm so ashamed. 'Cause you were being you, kind, generous, always thinking of others, and I reacted like some kind of monster. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with regret and the weight of what had happened. I felt tears picking at my eyes again, but I blinked them back. We weren't done yet. So what now? I asked, voicing the question that had been haunting me since he left. Jacob sighed, moving to sit on the couch. After a moment's hesitation, I joined him, making sure to leave space between us. I don't know, he admitted. I spent all night thinking about it, and I still don't know what you did with the money. Scares me, Annalise. Scares me because we worked so hard for that safety net and now it's gone. I opened my mouth to argue, but he held up a hand. Let me finish, please. It scares me, but I also know that's who you are. You see someone in need and you help. It's one of the things I've always loved about you, even if I don't always understand it. His words caught me off guard in all our years together. Jacob had never really articulated what he loved about me beyond the usual platitudes. Hearing him say this now in the midst of our crisis made my heart ache in a whole new way. So where does that leave us? I asked softly. Jacob turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. I couldn't quite decipher. I don't know, he said again. But I do know that I love you, Annalise, and I know that what I did was wrong, so incredibly wrong. I want to make this right somehow. I don't know how. As I sat there, looking at the man I had promised to spend my life with, I felt a glimmer of something that might have been hope. We were broken. Yes, the trust between us had been shattered in a way I wasn't sure could ever be fully repaired. But the fact that we were here talking, trying to understand each other, maybe that was a start. I think I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, that we have a lot of work to do. What happened last night changed things. Jacob, I can't just forget it or pretend it didn't happen. He nodded, his face solemn. I know, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, Annalise, whatever it takes. We sat in silence for a while after that, both lost in our own thoughts. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the living room. Outside, I could hear the distant laughter of the neighbor kids, playing, a reminder that life was going on as normal for the rest of the world, even as ours had been turned upside down. Finally, I stood up. I'm going to make some dinner. I said we both need to eat. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step, however small, towards whatever our new normal might be. As I moved towards the kitchen, I felt Jacob's eyes on me, and I knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey for us both. But for the first time since last night, I felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, we might find our way through this together. The days that followed were strange, to say the least. Jacob and I tiptoed around each other, our conversations stilted and uncomfortable. It was like we were stuck in some sort of limbo, neither moving forward nor going back to how things were before we slept in the same bed. But it felt like there was an ocean between us. I threw myself into work at the library, grateful for the distraction. Mrs. Edward noticed something was off. That woman's got a sixth sense for these things, but I brushed off her concerned looks with forced smiles and vague reassurances. The last thing I needed was for the town gossip mill to start churning at home. Jacob and I fell into a sort of routine. He'd come home from the bank, would make small talk over dinner, then retreat to separate corners of the house. I spent a lot of time on the porch reading or just watching the world go by. Jacob took to tinkering in the garage, the sound of tools and occasional muttered curses floating through the open windows. It was on one of these quiet evenings, about a week after the incident, as I'd taken to calling it in my head, that everything changed again. I was sitting on the porch swing, a cup of tea cooling beside me when I first heard it. At first it was just a faint hum, barely noticeable over the chirping of crickets and the distant bark of the Thompsons' dog. But then it grew louder, a steady through that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I sat up straighter, my book forgotten, as I scanned the darkening sky. That's when I saw it, a dark shape moving against the clouds, heading straight for us. Jacob, I called out, my voice tight with a mixture of fear and confusion. Jacob, come out here. I heard the clatter of tools being dropped, then Jacob's hurried footsteps. He burst onto the porch, wiping his hands on an old rag. What is it? Words failed me for a moment. I just pointed at the sky where the shape was growing larger by the second. Jacob's eyes widened as he realized what we were seeing. Is that a helicopter? He asked, disbelief coloring his voice. Before I could respond, the noise became deafening. The helicopter was definitely heading our way, and it was coming in fast. Wind whipped around us, sending loose papers from the side table flying and nearly knocking over my forgotten tea. Get inside, Jacob shouted over the noise, grabbing my arm, but I shook him off, transfixed by the sight. Before me, the helicopter was descending onto our front lawn. I watched in amazement as it touched down the grass, bowing under the force of the rotors. The entire house seemed to shake. Picture frames rattling on the walls and the porch swings swaying wildly. As the blades began to slow, I became aware of movement around us. Neighbors were spilling out of their houses. Drawn by the commotion, I could see old Mr. Grayson from across the street, still in his bathrobe, mouth agape. The Wilsons from next door were on their front porch, little Timmy bouncing excitedly in his father's arms. What in the world? Jacob muttered beside me, echoing my own thoughts. The helicopter door swung open and 3 men stepped out. Even in the fading light I could see they were sharply dressed, dark suits, crisp white shirts, and ties that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. They moved with a kind of practiced grace, seemingly unfazed by the chaos their arrival had caused. One of the men, tall with salt and pepper hair, was carrying a sleek briefcase. The other, shorter and younger, scanned the growing crowd before his eyes landed on us. He said something to his companion, then started walking purposefully towards our porch. I felt Derek tense beside me, his hand finding mine and squeezing it tightly. Whatever was happening, whatever this was about, we were in it together. The thought gave me a strange sort of comfort. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, the younger man, called out as he approached, his voice carrying easily over the dying whine of the helicopter blades. Jacob cleared his throat. Yes, that's us, he replied, his voice steadier than I expected. What's this all about? The man climbed the porch steps, his colleague close behind. Up close, I could see that despite his polished appearance, there was a kindness in his eyes that put me slightly at ease. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, he said, offering a small smile. But time was of the essence, and Mr. Joshua was quite insistent at the mention of Mr. Joshua's name. I felt my knees go weak. Jacob's arm went around my waist supporting me, and I was grateful for his steady presence. Mr. Joshua, I managed to croak out, is everything okay? The man's smile widened. Everything is more than okay, Mrs. Holloway. In fact, that's why we're here. Mr. Joshua asked us to deliver something to you personally. With that, he nodded to his colleague, who stepped forward and placed the briefcase on the small table between us. The older man opened it with a soft click, and I gasped at what I saw inside. Stacks upon stacks of crisp green bills, more money than I'd ever seen in my life. What I don't understand, Jacob said, his voice faint with shock. The younger man reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This will explain everything, he said, handing it to me. It's from Mr. Joshua himself. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. I'd seen it on countless receipts and order forms at the hardware store over the years. Dear Annalise, I read aloud, my voice quivering. Your selflessness has given me the greatest gift of all time. Doctors tell me I may live several more pain-free years, and it's because of you. This money is the least I can do to repay your kindness. Use it for your future, your dreams, or to help others as you helped me. With all my gratitude. Lawrence Joshua. Tears were streaming down my face by the time I finished reading. I looked up at Jacob, seeing my own shock and disbelief mirrored in his eyes. There's more, the older man said, gesturing to the briefcase. Mr. Joshua was quite clear about the amount. It's 10 times what you gave him for his treatment. I felt like the world was spinning around me 10 times. What we'd given that was life-changing money. I sank onto the porch swing, my legs no longer able to support me. Jacob knelt in front of me, taking my hands in his knees. He said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. I looked into his eyes, seeing a swirl of emotions there, amazement, relief, and something else, something that looked a lot like remorse. The men from the helicopter quietly excused themselves, leaving the briefcase on the table as they walked back to their waiting aircraft. I became aware again of our neighbors still watching in stunned silence. This would be the talk of Millbrook for years to come, I was sure, but right now none of that mattered. All that mattered was Jacob kneeling before me, his hands warm around mine. You were right, he said softly. So only I could hear you were right to help him, and I was so wrong. Fresh. Tears spilled down my cheeks, but this time they weren't just from shock or relief. They were tears of hope. Hope. That maybe, just maybe, this miraculous turn of events could be the start of healing for us. As the helicopter lifted off, kicking up a whirlwind of leaves and grass, Jacob and I clung to each other on the porch. The money in the briefcase would change our lives, yes. But in that moment I realized that the real miracle wasn't the cash. It was the second chance we'd been given, a chance to rebuild what had been broken, to remember why we'd fallen in love in the first place. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. We had a lot to work through, a lot to forgive. But as I looked at Jacob, saw the love and determination in his eyes. I knew we'd find a way together. The helicopter's thunderous departure left an eerie silence in its wake. Jacob and I stood on the porch, still holding each other, staring at the briefcase on the table as if it might disappear at any moment. Our neighbors, who had gathered to witness the spectacle, slowly dispersed, their excited whispers carrying on the evening breeze. I knew by morning the whole town would be buzzing with speculation. We should probably take that inside. Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, with shaking hands. Jacob picked up the briefcase. It looked so ordinary, so innocuous, to be carrying what amounted to a small fortune. We walked into the house together, closing the door on the outside world and the prying eyes of our neighbors in the living room. Jacob set the briefcase on the coffee table. We sat on the couch, both of us unable to take our eyes off it. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in, and I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my chest. Jacob, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Did that really just happen? Or did I fall asleep on the porch and dream the whole thing? He reached out and pinched my arm gently. If you're dreaming, then I'm having the same dream, he said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that did it. The laughter I'd been holding back burst forth, and once I started, I couldn't stop. Jacob looked at me in surprise for a moment before joining in his deep chuckles, mixing with my near hysterical giggles. We laughed until tears streamed down our faces, the release of tension almost painful in its intensity. As our laughter finally subsided, I wiped my eyes and took a deep breath. Okay, I said, trying to gather my thoughts. Okay, we need to think this through. What are we going to do with all this money? Jacob ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before when he was trying to process something complex. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. It's life-changing, Annalise. I nodded, the weight of our new reality settling on my shoulders. We need to be smart about this, I said. No rash decisions, agreed. Jacob said. He paused for a moment, then added softly, when I saw all that cash, my first thought was that we could replace our savings. Put it all back, pretend this never happened. I felt a flicker of annoyance at his words. But before I could respond, he continued. But then I realized that would be missing the point entirely. You gave our savings to Mr. Joshua because it was the right thing to do. And now, because of your kindness, we have this incredible opportunity. We can't waste it. His words caught me off guard. I'd been bracing myself for an I told you so moment. But instead, Jacob was acknowledging the value of what I'd done. Felt like a tiny crack in the wall that had formed between us. So what do you think we should do? I asked, genuinely curious to hear his thoughts. Jacob leaned back on the couch, his brow furrowed in concentration. Well, we definitely need to put some aside for emergencies. That's just common sense. But beyond that, I think we need to honor the spirit of Mr. Joshua's gift, he said, to use it for our future, our dreams, or to help others. Maybe we can find a way to do all three. I felt a warmth spreading in my chest. At his words, this was the Derek I'd fallen in love with, thoughtful, kind, always trying to do the right thing. Felt like I was seeing him clearly for the first time in weeks. I like that idea, I said, smiling. Maybe we could start by helping out some folks in town who are struggling. There's old Mrs. Peterson. Her roof's been leaking for years, but she can't afford to fix it. And the Edwards' son, Tommy, he's so bright, but they can't afford to send him to college. Jacob nodded enthusiastically. Those are great ideas. And what about your dream of opening a little bookstore? You've talked about that for years. I felt a flutter of excitement at the thought. A bookstore of my own had always seemed like a far-off fantasy. But now, do you really think we could do that with this money? Absolutely, Jacob said, grinning. We could find a space on Main Street, fix it up just the way you've always imagined. It would be amazing, Annalise. As we sat there throwing ideas back and forth, I felt something shift between us. The tension that had been our constant companion since that fateful night began to ease. We weren't just talking about money. We were talking about our future, making plans together. Felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. But even as excitement built, I knew we couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. The money was wonderful, yes, but it didn't erase what had happened between us. Jacob, I said, my voice growing serious, this is all wonderful and I'm so grateful for this opportunity. But we still have things we need to work through. What happened that night changed things between us. Jacob's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep remorse. I know, he said quietly, Annalise. I can never take back what I did. It was unforgivable and I will regret it for the rest of my life. But I want you to know that I am committed to making things right between us, whatever it takes, counseling time, anything. I love you and I want to be worthy of your trust again. His words brought tears to my eyes. I love you too, I said, and I want to work through this. But it's going to take time. Jacob, we can't just throw money at this problem and expect it to go away. You're right, he agreed. Maybe we could use some of this money for couples counseling. I think it would be good for us to have someone to help us navigate this. I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. I think that's a great idea, and maybe we could take a little trip, just the three of us, somewhere quiet where we can talk and reconnect without all the distractions of home. Jacob reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. I'd like that, he said. Very. Much as the night wore on, we continued to talk, making plans both big and small. We decided to sleep on any major decisions, knowing that we needed time to process everything that had happened. But as we finally headed to bed in the early hours of the morning, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in weeks. Lying in bed with Jacob's arm draped tentatively over my waist, I thought about the incredible turn our lives had taken. The money was amazing, yes, but it wasn't the most important thing we'd gained that day. We'd been given a second chance at our marriage, at our dreams, at making a real difference in our community. As I drifted off to sleep, I sent a silent thank you to Mr. Joshua. His generosity had done more than just repay a kindness. It had given us the opportunity to rebuild what we'd almost lost. And as I felt Jacob's steady breathing beside me, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead would face them together. The road to healing wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about our future, with love, understanding, and, yes, a little bit of unexpected fortune. I believed we could overcome anything as sleep finally claimed me. I smiled, looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. The days following Mr. Joshua's surprise gift were a whirlwind. Jacob and I found ourselves thrust into a world we'd never imagined, one where financial worries seemed to evaporate overnight. But as exciting as our newfound wealth was, we both knew that money alone couldn't fix what had been broken between us. We decided to start with couples counseling as we'd discussed that first night. Finding a therapist in Millbrook proved challenging. It's not exactly a bustling metropolis, but we eventually connected with Dr. Amelia Theodore in the next town over. She had a kind face and a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated from the moment we met her. Our first session was intense. Doesn't begin to cover it. Sitting in Dr. Barnes' cozy office with its overstuffed armchairs and soothing landscape paintings, I felt all the emotions I'd been trying to keep in check come bubbling to the surface. "So, tell me why you're here." Dr. Theodore set her pen poised over a notepad. I glanced at Jacob, who nodded encouragingly, taking a deep breath. I began to recount the events that had led us here, my decision to help Mr. Joshua, Jacob's reaction, and the unexpected twist of fate that had followed. As I spoke, I could see Jacob's face contorted with shame and regret. When I got to the part about him hitting me, his head dropped into his hands. Dr. Theodore listened intently, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp and observant. "Jacob," she said, when I'd finished, "would you like to share your perspective?" He lifted his head and my heart clenched at the sight of tears in his eyes. I messed up," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I let fear and anger control me, and I hurt the person I love most in this world. I'm ashamed of what I did, and I'm here because I want to make things right. I need to make things right." Dr. Theodore nodded, acknowledging the problem is an important first step. She said, "But healing takes time and effort from both parties." "Anais, how do you feel about what Jacob just said?" I took a moment to gather my thoughts. "I appreciate his honesty," I said slowly, "and I want to believe that we can move past this, but I'm scared what happened that night shook my trust in ways I'm still trying to understand." Over the next hour, Dr. Theodore guided us through a conversation that was both painful and cathartic. We talked about our different approaches to money and generosity, about the pressure Jacob felt as the primary breadwinner, about my tendency to make impulsive decisions without fully considering the consequences as difficult as it was. I felt a tiny spark of hope. By the end of the session, we had a long way to go, but at least we were really talking for the first time in what felt like forever. Dr. Theodore gave us homework exercises to practice active listening, ways to express our feelings without blame, and a recommendation to set aside time each day to check in with each other emotionally. As we left her office, Jacob reached for my hand. I hesitated for a moment before taking it, and I saw a flicker of hurt cross his face, but he squeezed my hand gently and we walked to the car in companionable silence. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a new routine. We'd have breakfast together each morning, taking turns to share something we were grateful for or a concern we had. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch swing talking about our days and our progress. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when old habits crept in. Jacob would get defensive about a financial decision, or I'd make a choice without consulting him. But slowly we learned to catch ourselves, to take a breath, and remember the tools Dr. Theodore had given us one evening. About a month after we started counseling, Jacob surprised me. I was curled up on the couch with a book when he came in, looking nervous but determined. "Anais," he said, sitting beside me, "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I want to show you something." He handed me a piece of paper. As I unfolded it, I realized it was a bank statement. My eyes widened as I saw the balance. It was exactly the amount we'd given to Mr. Joshua for his treatment. "I don't understand," I said, looking up at Jacob in confusion. He took a deep breath. "I've been putting aside money from my paycheck," he explained, "a little each week. I wanted to replace what we'd given away. Not because I think what you did was wrong, but because I want us to always be in a position to help others if we need to." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "Jacob, that's incredible. But what about the money Mr. Joshua gave us?" He smiled, a bit sheepishly. I thought we could use that for the bookstore you've always dreamed of, and maybe set up a fund to help others in town who are struggling with medical bills. In that moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, kind, thoughtful, always trying to do the right thing without thinking. I leaned in and kissed him. It was our first real kiss since that fateful night, and it felt like coming home. But even as we basked in this moment of connection, I knew we still had work to do. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend overnight. There were still nights when I'd wake up the memory of Jacob's anger, fresh in my mind, and I could see the way he sometimes hesitated before touching me, as if afraid I might flinch away. We continued our sessions with Dr. Theodore, gradually moving from once a week to every other week. She helped us navigate the complex emotions that came with our new financial situation, reminding us that money could be a tool for good but shouldn't define our relationship. As summer turned to fall, Jacob and I decided to take that trip we'd talked about. We chose a small bed and breakfast in the mountains, far from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of Millbrook, for a week. We hiked, talked, and rediscovered each other one evening. As we sat on a rocky outcrop watching the sunset, Jacob turned to me. "Inez," he said, his voice serious, "I need you to know something. What I did that night, it will never happen again. I swear to you on everything I hold dear that I will never raise a hand to you in anger, ever." I looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. "I believe you," I said softly, and I realized with a sense of relief so profound, brought tears to my eyes, that I really did. We still had our moments of disagreement. Of course, there were days when the weight of what had happened felt almost too heavy to bear. But we kept talking, kept working at it, and slowly, like a delicate flower pushing through cracks in concrete, our love began to bloom anew. As we drove back to Millbrook at the end of our trip, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. We weren't the same people we'd been before. All this happened. Maybe that was a good thing. We'd been tested, pushed to our limits, and we'd chosen to fight for each other. Our reconciliation was still fragile, a delicate thing that needed care and attention. But as I looked at Jacob, his profile illuminated by the setting sun as he drove, I knew that what we were building now was stronger than what we had before. It was a love tempered by hardship, strengthened by forgiveness, and deepened by understanding. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but I was ready to face whatever came our way together. It's funny how life can change in the blink of an eye. One moment you're worrying about making ends meet, and the next you're figuring out how to manage a small fortune. But money, as Jacob and I quickly learned, doesn't solve everything it can. However, open doors you never even knew existed. After much discussion and planning, we decided to make some big changes. Millbrook had been our home for as long as we could remember, but we both felt that a fresh start somewhere new might be just what we needed. We found a charming little town called Pine Grove about 3 hours away. It was similar to Millbrook in size, but it felt like a world apart. Our new home was a cozy cottage on the outskirts of town with a wraparound porch that reminded me of the one where this whole journey began. As we unpacked our boxes and settled in, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. One of the first things we did in Pine Grove was to look for a space for my bookstore. We found the perfect spot right on Main Street, an old, slightly run-down building that had once been a hardware store. It needed work, but I could see its potential right away. Jacob threw himself into the renovation project with an enthusiasm that surprised me. He spent hours poring over design books, consulting with local contractors, and even picking up a paintbrush himself. Watching him work, I saw glimpses of the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Determined, creative, always trying to make things better, we named the store Joshua's Reads in honor of the man whose generosity had made all this possible on opening day. As I stood behind the counter and looked out at the shelves filled with books, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. But our new life wasn't just about the bookstore. True to our word, we set up a foundation to help people in need, particularly those struggling with medical bills. We started small, focusing on Pine Grove and the surrounding area, but word spread quickly. Soon we were receiving letters and calls from people all over the state sharing their stories and asking for help. Reading these letters together became a nightly ritual for Jacob and me. Some of the stories broke our hearts. Parents unable to afford treatment for their sick children, elderly folks choosing between medicine and food but being able to help to make a real difference in people's lives, filled us both with a sense of purpose we'd never known before. One evening, as we sat on our porch swing going through the day's mail, Jacob turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about quitting my job at the bank." I raised an eyebrow. Surprised. Jacob had always been so career-focused. The idea of him voluntarily leaving his job seemed almost unthinkable. "Really? What brought this on?" He gestured to the letters spread out between us. "This work we're doing with the foundation. It feels more important than anything I've ever done before. I want to devote more time to it, maybe expand our reach." I felt a surge of pride and love for this man who had come so far. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said, squeezing his hand, and so our little foundation grew. Jacob threw himself into the work with the same dedication he'd once given to balancing books and managing accounts. We hired a small staff, set up a proper office, and started partnering with local hospitals and clinics to identify those most in need. As for me, the bookstore became more than just a business, it became a community hub. We hosted reading groups, author signings, and even started a program to provide free books to underprivileged kids in the area. The joy on a child's face when they received their very own book to keep was worth more than all the money in the world. Of course, our life wasn't perfect. We still had our disagreements, our moments of doubt and frustration. The memory of that terrible night in Millbrook never completely faded, but we learned to communicate better, to listen to each other, to face our problems head-on instead of letting them fester. We continued. Seeing Dr. Theodore making the 3-hour drive every other week, she marveled at our progress but reminded us that relationships require constant work and attention. "You've built a strong foundation," she told us in one session, "but you need to keep reinforcing it every single day." One crisp autumn morning about a year after we'd moved to Pine Grove, I woke up early and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jacob. I made a cup of tea and went out to the porch, wrapping myself in a cozy blanket as I watched the sun rise over the trees. As I sat there, I thought about the journey that had brought us here, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, but also the love, the growth, the unexpected blessings. I thought about Mr. Joshua, wondering if he knew just how much his act of generosity had changed not just our lives but the lives of so many others. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear Jacob come out until he sat down beside me, placing a gentle hand on my knee. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. I turned to look at him, taking in the gray starting to pepper his hair, the laugh lines around his eyes that seemed a bit deeper than they used to be. "I was just thinking about everything that's happened." I said, "How different our life is now." Jacob nodded, his eyes growing serious and amaze. He said, taking my hand in his, "I know I've said it before, but I need you to know I am so sorry for what happened that night, for hurting you, for letting my anger and fear control me." I put a finger to his lips, stopping him mid-sentence. "I know, Jacob, and I forgave you a long time ago. What matters is who we are now, what we've built together." He smiled, bringing my hand to his lips and kissing it softly. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," I replied, meaning it more than ever. As we sat there watching the town come to life below us, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Our life wasn't perfect. No life ever is, but it was good. We've faced our demons individually and as a couple, and come out stronger on the other side. Later that day, as I unlocked the door to Joshua's Reads and breathed in the comforting smell of books and coffee, I said a silent thank you to Mr. Joshua for his incredible gift, to Dr. Theodore for her guidance and wisdom, to Derek for his love and his willingness to change and grow. But mostly I thanked myself for having the courage to help someone in need, even when it seemed impossible, for fighting for my marriage, when it would have been easier to walk away, for believing that love, kindness, and generosity could truly change the world. As I flipped the sign on the door from closed to open, I smiled, ready to face whatever this new day might bring, because that's the thing about new beginnings. They're full of possibilities just waiting to be explored. and Jacob and I we were ready to explore them all. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thanks for listening and see you in the next videos.